Coming up on our next installment of America's Hope, how the power of hope actually can save people from death by despair. And you'll see one man who walks across America for the purpose of raising hope and giving help everywhere he goes. That's on our next installment of America's Hope. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to America's Hope. I'm Kelly Wright, and tonight we're talking about a very special aspect of hope. It's called the power of hope and the scientific nature of it. Tonight we'll be speaking to an economist talking about hope over despair. We'll also introduce you to a couple of people who will express how people in difficult circumstances are benefiting from the people who believe that there's power in hope, and actually thereby become not theory, but they put it into practice. That's all tonight on America's Hope. Let's get right to it. Question for you tonight: is there a science to hope? Think about that for a moment, and as you ponder over the answer, consider this. Hope is not just wishful thinking. It's actually a belief that can help you be confident and increase your awareness that you can overcome adversity or anything else that comes your way. Hope prevails. Well, it can even help you feel better about your life. Tonight, we're talking about the power of hope and well-being. And joining me now is Carol Graham. She is the Interim Vice President and Director of the Economic Studies Program at Brookings Institution. She's also a college prep professor at the University of Maryland and a senior scientist at Gallup. Her books include The Power of Hope, How Well-Being Science Can Save Us from Despair. And that's her current book that just came out. And she has also written a book called Happiness for All, Unequal Lives and Hopes in Pursuit of the American Dream. Carol, good of you to join us this hour on America's Hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
You know, it's a pleasure to talk to you about this wonderful science of hope. And who knew that hope could actually be a science? In your latest book, you talk about this, and you talk about the science of well-being and how hope applies to that. Can you explain?
Sure. It's a little odd for an economist to be working on writing about hope. And I've started my career as a development economist working on poverty and inequality in developing countries, poor countries. I'm from Peru originally. I did much more standard economics then, but what I found then, and I have found through time, is that people's emotions and aspirations matter to their investments in their future and their behavior. And about 20 years ago, I started working with a small group of economists and psychologists that developed the science of well-being. And it was essentially, we first started looking at the role of happiness, life satisfaction, positive well-being in people's outcomes. So first of all, why sometimes things you would think would make people happy didn't, like you always predict more money will, but if you make more money in, uncertain times and a lot of change in your life, no time with your family, it's a different dynamic. Or, why people at times of rapid growth actually have decreases in happiness. And that's because very rapid growth, say the China boom or other growth booms in different countries like India recently, some in Latin America before, you saw these big declines in life satisfaction at a time the economy was supposedly booming. But what you realize, it's a very uncertain process, and there are a lot of winners and there are a lot of losers. So it's complicated, and there are lots of determinants of happiness. But over time, I started to realize that it wasn't just that people with higher levels of happiness did better in terms of longevity, health, performance in the job market, but there was a more clear relationship between people who had hope for the future. That was the most important channel, and so I've been studying it more recently in the past few years, and looking at hope as not a momentary emotion, but actually a character trait, actually a trait that has what I call agentic properties. As Amanda Gorman said in her poem at the inauguration of Joe Biden, hope is not a promise we give, it's a promise we live. And the reason for that is that the hope is distinct from, say, sort of raw optimism that sometimes people have no choice but to have to survive if they live in very deprived circumstances. But hope comes with the belief that you can make your life better. It isn't just the belief that things will be better, but that you can make your life better. And at the
So,
same time, oh, sorry,
oh
one
no,
last line on
sure,
that.
please.
I've been studying the what I call a crisis of despair in this country, the deaths of despair, in which over 100,000 Americans die each year of premature death, suicide, overdose, and other preventable causes, and trying to understand what is going on in this country. Why are so many people without hope? So I've been studying both hope and despair. But I think that it is time that we really think about how we can restore hope in society and what are the tangible lessons we can learn from.
Well, let's start right there. How do we restore hope in our society when, through the austerity of despair, they've lost hope? How do we bridge that divide that exists in America right now?
Right, and what we have in general in America is a country increasingly of have and have-nots, people who have opportunity and people who don't, and people who have lost hope for the future give up. So they don't, even if there are opportunities, they may be hard to get, but if even if they exist, they're not going to pursue them if they don't believe they have a future, right? And so what we have in terms of describing our pattern of despair is particular in hollowed out communities which have lost not just their economic source of living, right? Declining manufacturing areas, other places, urban blight. They're different kinds of communities, but they've also, as a part of that, they've lost their community fabric. They've lost their narrative for living. They've lost pride of place, right? If you live somewhere where everybody is dying of suicide and overdose, it's kind of hard to keep your head up and think you have a better future. And so that's obviously very tricky. How do you turn that around? And one of the things I've learned working with groups in different places, some deprived communities here in the United States, a lot more in the UK, which has done a lot more work on this, that there are some tools that we can teach young kids, for example, things like self esteem. You know, how do you deal with bullying? How do you combat loneliness? Things that become sort of much bigger barriers to success as they develop over time and later in people's lives or as they go through people's lives. And then also, we need to understand what the determinants of well being are. And some of the, unfortunately, even though we have a very vibrant economy, some of the other really key determinants of well being are really fraying in this society. One is just access to good health care. Not some people have access to the best health care in the world, and many people have terrible health care, if access at all. And we see that we have, of all rich countries, we have a higher level of, for example, maternal mortality than all the other rich countries. Now, what does that say about us, right? And then the other thing that we have is we have a very decentralized and frayed social safety net. So some programs are great, and in particular the programs that reward work, like earned income tax credit. But if you're a single mother with, teeny little kids and you don't have good childcare or you don't have good transportation, it's very hard to work. So you aren't eligible for the earned income tax credit. Any of the programs that support people in need, things like TANF, right, cash assistance for the needy, they come with stigma attached. They're very much determined by the state you live in. Um, Other countries, other wealthy countries, just have built-in safety net programs. And so one of the things I noticed during COVID was that when people in other wealthy countries lost their jobs or during the shutdowns in COVID, they didn't lose everything because in the US, your job is often the only way you get health insurance. So that means that if you become unemployed, you don't just become unemployed and lose your job, which is a bad thing anyway,
Mhm.
but you often risk losing your health insurance. What do you do in terms of family? The sort of uncertainty that people of low means live with in this country becomes, I think it becomes a real barrier to having a decent, a decent quality of life, but also having hope for the future because you're struggling so much to get through each day. You can't plan ahead. So there are a lot of things, some structural, sort of typical social policy things, some, labor market policies, healthcare policies. All of those things matter to people's quality of life and well-being. And then in addition, there really are lessons we can learn that bring communities into restoring hope, that bring peers into helping people in despair seek out help, that restores, I said, pride of place. So
Yeah.
it's a complicated topic and a
Yeah, it's
complicated recipe for
it,
success. But at the same
indeed.
time, in my view, without hope, we really have, you know, we risk losing a lot more people in our society to sort of, you know, not just this generation, but the next generation, of a whole, cohort of people in despair.
Uh, you're talking about a program, though, that the power of hope, how well-being science can improve our lives, and you're talking about those who are caught and falling through the cracks. Uh, Quite often, we look at them as being the marginalized, the oppressed. They might be from different ethnic groups, but isn't it true that hope can, it can hit rock bottom in anyone's life, whether they're wealthy or poor, black or white, native?
Absolutely, and some of the most desperate people in our society now that are very much represented in the deaths of despair are not what we would have considered marginalized communities. They're the remainder of the white working class, right? They're the people that live in places, um, with declining manufacturing jobs and other declining blue collar jobs,
And,
and
and, and isn't
unlike
that,
minorities that tend to have, more coping mechanisms,
yeah,
informal community ties, safety nets, because they haven't always had the good jobs, right?
right.
The, these were people who had a narrative and a lifestyle where you worked hard, you got ahead, you had a respected job. Life wasn't glamorous; it wasn't a glamorous job, but it was stable. Sort of, it was a very much a kind of part of community and society and the narrative that people lived, and that is really fading away. And what I really most worry about in some of the interviews I've done that are in the book is low income white kids who graduate high school and that's it. And they have no support in going further than that. It doesn't mean they have to go to college, but
Yeah.
in tomorrow's labor markets, there are very little opportunities for people with just a high school degree.
And isn't that center of their universe? Is that part of the death by despair that we see, as you mentioned earlier, from suicide or checking out of life with just getting hooked on drugs, anything to escape the perceived reality that they have? Because you talked about hope requires basically people being accountable to themselves and to each other and having the responsibility to go out and make sure they don't give up, but to keep going forward and working. But if you have a small, well, not a small, but a growing trend of people who are not getting a higher education or even educating themselves spiritually, mentally, physically, we run the risk of losing them. How do we gain? How do we get them back into hoping?
Right. And I think you said it well. It doesn't just mean getting educated. I mean, obviously, they're all different kinds of education now, and college is not for everyone, and college isn't affordable for a lot of people. But there are vocational programs, there are community colleges that, give people a start, and get them going on a professional track. There are skills like medium level programming for increasingly important technology jobs that kids who have only graduated high school who train in those can acquire skills and get decent jobs, but they don't nobody is guiding them. And
Mm,
if their parents are in despair,
mm.
you get an intergenerational transmission of
Wow.
that. And
Okay, we got
so
to
but one
start.
thing that you said that was really important was another kind of education is kind of, whether you call it spiritual or non religious spirituality. It doesn't have to be religion, but it is the sense that people have an anchor that helps them believe they can
Yes.
get ahead, right? A coping mechanism. And the other thing is that this idea of communities, right? That it is often community members that can help people in despair. They know who they are. You can't just walk in as say, a psychiatrist into a declining community and identify who's in despair and do something about it, right?
Right.
So, and often people in despair don't seek out help, nor do they want to, right? So again, there are now actually efforts to involve communities in the provision of mental health care and other things. And there are also programs that can teach kids skills starting in middle and high school that can help them sort of deal with uncertain futures and train for things they might want to do and have some ideas about what they need, the skills they need. And I think that really is lacking.
That is a great thought. We want you to hold that thought because I'd like to come back and unpack that a little bit more about what we can do for our future generation going into high school, middle school, grade school to teach them the power of hope, how well-being science can save us from despair, which is the title of your book. I'm talking to Carol Graham. We'll be back with more of America's Hope in just a moment. And welcome back to America's Hope. I'm Kelly Wright, and I'm joined by Carol Graham. She is the author of The Power of Hope, How Well-Being Science Can Save Us from Despair. And Carol, I'm delighted to have this conversation with you because hope is a very important aspect of American life. It's something that foreigners had often looked to America saying, there's the city on a shining hill, shining light. It's a beacon of hope. And your studies have revealed that that light is tarnished and it's dimming and hope is waning, particularly in our younger generation. So you were talking about how it would be a nice thing to add to our society and our educational system by teaching hope and the principles of hope and the science of hope to our children. How's that going so far in terms of getting some educators to really get behind you?
I think there's actually more momentum than you would think, and it isn't, just hope. You're teaching kids soft skills, socio-emotional skills, um, different kinds of cognitive skills, things that our traditional curriculum don't emphasize, right? For example, high school curriculums emphasize algebra and literacy and all these things, and that's very important. But it's very much a kind of a test-taking culture, more than in other countries. And so there are some examples. There's a wonderful program in the UK, in the Greater Manchester district, which is a deprived part of the UK, and it's called Be Well. And it teaches children in middle and high school things like self-esteem, um, how to combat loneliness, how to plan and think about the future. And so it teaches them the sort of skills that we haven't thought of as part of educating kids. And yet those are the skills that are increasingly valued in the labor market. And here I put my economist hat back on, which is that, if you don't train people for where the jobs, with the skills needed, where jobs are growing, they're not going to get good jobs. They're going to get, low quality jobs and lead, another cycle of precarious kind of hand to mouth living, which is, it's not what we would think of as the American dream. And so there's some programs developing in the U.S., not as many, but some that focus on things like flourishing, right? Which is a kind of it's almost another way to think of hope. It's the
Mm-hmm.
idea that, you know, money isn't everything. Having purpose and meaning in life gives you an anchor. It gives you, something to keep you going. It gives you hope, right? And one of I think the most frightening things about people in despair who don't have hope, who've basically given up on their future life, and in the end don't care if they live or die, which is why you see all these deaths of despair, is that they're very vulnerable to misinformation, conspiracy theories, all sorts of things, radicalization, political radicalization, because they don't have an anchor, right? They don't have something that keeps their life on track. And part of that is not having community. People in isolation are much more likely to be in despair. The two go together. Again, communities matter, and there's a role for kind of building communities and restoring pride of place, as I mentioned. Um, and then, there's also a role for what we can teach the next generation. And really quickly, there are some efforts. A colleague of mine at Brookings, whose name is Tony Pipa, has been doing some programs on rural revival, but rural communities who are declining or which have declined. And what he finds is that things like restoring a tourism industry or whatever's there, that they sort of had before that's declined. Not the manufacturing firm because that's not going to work, but an alternative kind of industry can make a big difference because people begin to have pride of place again, right? They don't think of where they live in their community as a declining place, and that's part of the process that leads to restored hope. Part
And
of it is having an anchor and having some pride.
exactly, because when you shape it and form a community that has a place to grow and they have opportunities to work, that causes them to have more of as a self-esteem, as you talked about. But you were talking about the politics as well, and just looking at the political nature of the way the landscape is today. As you know, it's very partisan, very divisive. We have the left and the right complaining towards each other. They're usually the extremes, but in between is mainstream America. And mainstream America is saying, well, we're not far left, we're not far right, but we are in the center, and we need to have a centerpiece of growth in America, a centerpiece of hope that we can grow in America. How do we get there through the political landscape that's going to get very dicey now that we're getting into presidential politics?
Right. And I very much agree with you. I think the average person is quite bothered by the amount of partisan politics there is right now. It divides families. There's no good about it. It's also really bad for young people because they stop believing that the system can work, right? Um, how do we get there is a tough and big question. I do think that well being in general, which includes hope, but it also includes meaning and purpose in life and related concepts, life satisfaction, emotional well being. I think that, a focus on well being is a nonpartisan focus, right?
Yeah,
Because it's
absolutely.
about people's lives.
It
It's
really
not
is.
about, and you can craft social programs that are not far out progressive, and at the same time you don't have to, you can um, and they can have incentives for people to work, but you can't sort of assume that everybody can work, and if they don't work they don't merit health care, right? I mean, so there is a middle road, and a lot of it is as you say, the extremes and the language of the extremes, when in fact the majority of people just want, they want to get ahead. They would like to have hope in America. They want to believe in the American dream. Who doesn't?
And so, in the process of your research, are you finding that people are marshaling the forces in to try to put an end to that type of practice where it's death by despair and living by hope instead?
I wish I could say yes, right? I think it's a big problem. It's growing, and it's not growing. A lot of people think things are COVID related, like they blame the rise in anxiety and depression among youth on COVID. It started in 2011, right? COVID
Mm-hmm.
exacerbated things. It was a shock, right? That but we all faced, and yet some of the people who've had the hardest time in COVID, low income minorities, for example, actually remain more hopeful during and after COVID than other groups. So it's complicated. But COVID aside, one of the things we've seen, and this is a nefarious trend that I don't know exactly what we can do about, but it's the increase in drugs such as fentanyl, which are very lethal, very cheap, and increasingly widely available.
Yeah.
And so what you've saw during COVID was that the suicide rate remained pretty steady, remarkably. Um, but actually, it's overdoses that went up, mainly driven by fentanyl. And overdoses spread beyond the sort of typical deaths of despair cohorts that were low income, you know, white, white working class blue collar workers. They spread much more to minorities. And what we don't know is how many overdoses are intentional and how many are not, right? So the estimates are between 15 and 60%. So you can say, well, suicide rates stayed steady for those 2 years, but overdoses went up dramatically. So we still have a raging crisis of despair. And I think a lot about it. I do a fair amount of work in it. The reason I'm working on hope is that you have to think of the sort of bigger picture
Yeah.
solutions and why are the deaths of despair. But solving the current problem is a very big challenge. And one thing I'm always amazed about is how little attention it's gotten. Over the past decade, we have been losing over 100,000 Americans a year to preventable premature death. Our life expectancy has gone down rather than up from 2015 on. Why don't we talk about that? Why isn't that in the news more, right? It's
You're
been
absolutely right.
dominated.
It's a very good question that's being asked, and it's one of the reasons why I'm glad that we're doing this show, America's Hope, because we do need to remind people of those things that are robbing us of our lives and getting back to and finding growth opportunities. And that's the power of hope. That's well-being. That's the science of all that. And I'm delighted that you're doing the work that you're doing, along with your colleagues at various institutions and academia. And it's time to tell the people who are making all the noise on the left and the right and the extremes to actually be quiet for a moment. And let's get busy doing some work, coming to the center and helping each other grow and build better. Good, better, best, never let it rest. Let your good become better and your better become best. You got to start somewhere.
I agree with you. I mean, the amount of time and energy we spend on visceral partisan political debates versus what really matters to people in this country it is destructive. Um, and I think there's less and less patience for it, which is a good thing.
That is a good thing. And it's a good thing that you're doing. Carol Graham, author of The Power of Hope, How Well-Being Science Can Save Us from Despair. Thank you for the work that you're doing. It's a good book. I recommend people read it and apply some of the principles and recommendations that you make in that. Don't be a stranger. Come on back anytime on America's Hope and keep telling us how we can help formulate a better society by just talking about hope.
Well, thank you, Kelly. We're learning as we go for at this point.
It's a process, right? But it's a good process.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carol Graham. We'll be back with
Thanks for
more.
having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. We'll be back with more of America's Hope in just a moment. Welcome back to America's Hope. I'm Kelly Wright. When times of disaster strike, we reach out to help each other, to provide each other with a hope that prevails in times of weariness and struggle. And certainly we've experienced that this past summer with triple-digit heat going on in various places throughout the country. The temperatures have been soaring, and we've also experienced unexpected flooding from torrential downpours. In fact, it happened recently here in the New York area, about an hour outside of New York City in Orange County, in Highland Falls. And my friend and colleague, Chris Spears, joins us now to talk about this remarkable story of seeing people from a community that you're acquainted with because you grew up there, and you saw a lot of compassion and a lot of hope on display. Tell me about it, please.
Yeah, so it started to rain, but it was just extremely heavy. And this town is on a hillside, so the water just accumulated like no one had ever seen before. People who lived there for 20 years never saw anything like this. Houses were even washed away. A lot of people were homeless. And some people took it to themselves to step up and help their neighbors.
Yeah, and I understand in other counties there were torrential downpours, and sadly, one person lost her life as she was trying to get out of her home and was swept away. But getting back to Highland Falls, what kind of area is it? I understand it's near West Point, and West Point itself was experiencing some flooding as well.
That's right. Yeah, it's just a few minutes from West Point, and that whole area is kind of mountainous. So what happens is when it rains in that sort of area, the water kind of collects, runs down the mountains, and any town downstream of the mountains or downhill of the mountains will get hit with that water. And for some reason, this particular rainstorm, which only lasted a few hours, created just a massive flood potential. I mean, one woman described the water as if a dam broke in the town.
Wow. But what struck me, Chris, in your piece was seeing how many people came out to help each other. And the reason why I wanted to have you on is to talk about that synergy of hope that was on full display.
Yeah, it was, when I was there, it was incredibly heartwarming. We were talking to volunteers, we were talking to people at a food pantry, we talked to the Red Cross coordinator, and at the end of the day, at the end of our interviews, I was this close to putting down my mic and getting my rough shoes out of my car and volunteering myself, because the energy there was incredible. I mean, people were stepping up. People who maybe had never participated in the community in their whole lives were coming out while we were there. Even while I was interviewing the head of the food pantry, a young woman came by to just say, "Hey, I'd like to volunteer."
Yes, so yeah, churches, food pantry, Red Cross, and the people of Highland Falls coming together. I don't like disasters, but I do like seeing that in the middle of a disaster, Americans come together regardless of their religion, their color, their political stripes. It's so refreshing to see that. Now if we could just bottle that and use that for everyday life in America.
Oh my gosh, if everybody lived like this all the time, there would be no problems, everybody would be helping each other constantly. These people were in almost an altered state. You could see it in their eyes. I mean, they were just ready to do anything and everything for their neighbors at the drop of the hat. All it would take is somebody to say, "Hey, I need this," somebody would already be getting it.
Yeah, we want to watch a little bit of your piece right now. Let's take a look at it right now, Chris.
We went to a local church where community members and first responders partnered up to address the crisis. Let's hear from some local residents as well as some of the first responders. Were you here on Sunday when the rain started?
Yes, I was actually in my apartment watching the water roll on down the street, watch garbage cans and toys just go by me, yes.
Right now there's people from Red Cross, we're calling people from FEMA, just to try and get some help because a lot of insurances aren't covering the flood damage, so people are kind of left, with damages and stuff that they can't replace. So we're hoping that FEMA comes through and helps people out so they can get back on their feet.
I know we serviced well over 300 vehicles getting supplies. We have people staying here that lost their homes and people who are continuing to come here and realize they have a place to stay, because a lot of people just think it's supplies only, but we have a whole, Red Cross has a whole setup inside.
So it's certainly a traumatic experience, and it's tolling both on the workers and the folks who are here. It really does take the community as a whole to recover from these type of events. So it's really nice to see how well the community here has come together for each other in their time of need.
Chris, that's really remarkable, especially when you hear them saying things like, well, if FEMA doesn't show up, and we hope that they do, we will continue to work together to help each other. That's important because that goes back to our DNA as America, our founding principles, our founding fathers and mothers all band together to help each other in times of trouble. Native Americans, slaves and freed slaves, and of course all of Americans coming together, even back then while we had so many things to overcome. Hasn't changed. We still have a lot to overcome politically in this country.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There's more than a lot to overcome. I mean, people are out there at each other's throats. Even families are divided. But I think an event like this just calls the best out of people, because they're looking around and they see their neighbors and nobody's there to help except for they themselves. And this better nature comes out.
Yeah.
when this kind of thing happens.
And that's good to see that better nature, the better angels that they're addressing and listening to. And certainly there's still a lot more work ahead of Highland Falls because they've lost some homes and they have to rebuild. Is that right?
That's right. A lot of people are without homes. When we were there, it was just a few days after the flooding, but so they didn't have a sense for how big the damage was. They were still just helping whoever they could. But we heard about people whose entire homes were lost. We heard about people who lost the entire first floor.
Yeah, rebuilding, recovery, it's a heavy lift, but keep us updated. Update us when you get a chance to go back to Highland Falls. And it's a beautiful area if any of you have ever been to that part of New York. And certainly we've seen disaster throughout the country because of flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes, natural disasters. But in every natural disaster, as Chris was just talking about, it's wonderful to see people coming together and giving each other hope that lifts them up. And that is so important, hope rising in the midst of despair. We're going to take a break, but again, when you're watching NTD, make sure you check out my friend and buddy Chris Beers, who is the anchor of NTD News at noon. Chris, thank you.
Absolutely, Kelly.
Appreciate you. We'll be back with more of America's Hope in just a moment. Welcome back to America's Hope. I'm Kelly Wright, and I'm joined by a man who just has hope pouring through his pores, and he actually walks it and talks it and lives it. Let me introduce you to Pastor Rick Hagins. He is the pastor of Harvest Evangelism based in Auburn, Alabama. Auburn, Alabama. I know you love football, Pastor.
You better believe it, War Eagle.
All right. And Charles Barkley, of course, the famous alum from Auburn as well, basketball
Graduated
great.
with me. He was in my class.
Oh, look at that. Wow, it's a small world, isn't it?
Him, Bo Jackson, and Frank Thomas were all in my class.
You are from the class of the elite of Auburn then, no doubt.
No, I'm from the class of old men.
Talk to me about why you embarked on walking throughout the states, the United States of America.
Absolutely. And it's kind of a twofold thing. You know, God, if you delight yourself in the Lord, He'll give you the desires of your heart. And most people's desires is different from me, but I broke my back in high school playing football. And so I actually spent 15 months in the hospital. They didn't know if I'd ever walk again. Was in a body cast from my neck down to my knees. Back then when they did spinal surgery, they put you in an old plaster cast. And so, you know, for 15 months, you know, I'm in the hospital. When I get out, I still have a lot of trouble. They say, you'll never be able to run. You'll never be able to do much, walk with canes and all. But the Lord touched me and healed me. And I've become a pretty good runner and ran high school and ran in college. So I got older. I promise you, I have slowed down considerably, but I like to walk. And God says, you know what, I'm going to let you walk as part of your ministry. I was in Mexico about 30 years ago in a garbage dump, not throwing away, you know, my Red Bull can, but I was in a garbage dump because that's where folks lived. And we were giving away Christmas presents. It was our last day. We didn't have a lot left to give away. And so this little boy came up to me, probably 4 or 5 years old, and I had given him a Tonka truck. At the time, I was teaching school as well as being a preacher. I've done a lot of things to make a living, and I preached to make my life. And so I thought I'd go back home to my school right outside Tuskegee, Alabama, and I could save up some money and buy some shoes. But I was preaching at a big church, nice church. This church, they could have filmed a Tarzan movie at the church, had so many Jaguars in the parking lot. And I said, these folks have got some money. I'm going to teach them to get up off that wallet. Now, I'm a Baptist preacher, and Baptists aren't so easy to get them to move around. And if I tell people, you know why Baptists don't raise their hand in worship? It leaves their wallet uncovered. I talked to them about Mexico. I talked to this little boy, and I said, we've been to Mexico to meet him if you'll get me some shoes, and I'll walk across Alabama. And so they said, yeah. And so then I took it a step further, and I said, I'll walk across Alabama barefoot like my little buddy in Mexico if you get me 10 pair of shoes every mile that I walk. And so that first year, I tried walking barefoot. It was 4th of July. It's hot in Alabama. I burned my feet up so bad, had to go to the hospital.
I bet you did.
But the second day, I woke up in the morning to go walking, just trying to get ready and trying to put medicine on my feet. And I looked out the front door, and there was a big old white truck that said CNN News. And there was another truck that said ESPN. And they just picked up the news story because it was slow news, and we're not that far from Atlanta. And so they covered me all day. They didn't know what to do with a walking preacher, and then do some of my accent. And I'm kind of the outcast in the church, you know. So they spent the whole day with me and covered it. And I walked across Alabama. Eventually, I did put my shoes on, too hot. But we were hoping to raise 10 pair of shoes for every mile, 340 miles. So my goal was about 3,500 pair of shoes. With that first year, I raised 60,000 pair of shoes.
Wow.
Thanks to the press.
I wanted to ask you what it was like when you returned to Mexico and you found that little boy and you put shoes on his feet. What was his reaction?
I don't think he thought I would come back. You know, we make a lot of promises sometimes. And so I was raised up to keep your word. So I asked people, how far would you go to keep your word? And for me, I just topped 17,000 miles walking, keeping my word. And that's what touched the little boy. He liked the shoes I took him. I had a good pair of shoes. And I got a mama a good pair of shoes. And the grandmama, I got 2 pair of shoes for the grandmama because she cooked some tacos for me. And so we had a grand time there. We made friends with those people. That's my kin. Matter of fact, I went back a couple of years later, and there was a baby there in that neighborhood, not right there at the garbage dump, but just a little ways away in an even worse neighborhood, even worse. And I thought the baby was dead. And so I told the youth group that was with me, I said, let's at least dig a hole and give the baby a good funeral. We're too late to help her. And my son, who was about 7 years old, went over and poked the dead baby, and the baby moved. He said, Daddy, she ain't dead. So we didn't bury her. You know what we did? We adopted her.
Oh, my goodness.
We named her Dreamer. And so she came back, and she talks as country as I do, but she is a Mexican, and she's working in Nashville at a vet clinic, very smart, wonderful young lady. So you can make a difference. You know, I tell people all the time, religion will tell you, commands you, come inside, take a seat, and watch the show.
Yeah.
But faith invites you to get up off of your seat, take a step, and see where to take you. And for me, it's taken me all over America. I've walked across 40 states.
As you walked across the country, getting shoes for people, I'd like you to explain why shoes are so important.
Absolutely. And shoes kind of have a twofold purpose. Number one, it's that old adage, it's where the rubber hits the road, where the shoe leather hits the road. It's hard to have a job or get to school. It's hard to do anything without shoes. I can remember as a kid, we grew up very poor, and my mama would patch up my breeches. They'd be clean, and other kids at school, their breeches were patched up too. But everybody made fun of you for your shoes. They said, where do you get them pie crusts? Your grandmama baked them. If you had bad shoes, you got picked on. And so I always remember that when I became a teenager and got a job, the first thing I did was buy me a good pair of shoes. And so I think about that, but I also think about the fact that Christians are often accused, and sometimes rightfully so, that we talk the talk, but we don't walk the walk. Mm-hmm. So shoes become symbolic of walking the walk. And that's me. I love to get the shoe, but that ain't why I'm walking. I'm walking to see America and see Americans. I'm walking so people can meet me on the highway. They don't know I'm a preacher. I don't have a cross. I'm just walking. And I hitchhike back to my vehicle after I walk. And so when people pick me up hitchhiking, they don't know who I am. You know, I've had some of the most grand and glorious and divine encounters just on the side of the road. It restores your hope in America.
What would you say about America's hope? Is it tarnished? Is it broken? Is it in despair? Or is it that in the news media, we aren't giving enough attention to the fact that there are people like you who really believe in hope and letting hope prevail against all odds?
Well, I thank you for what you're doing. When I'm not walking, what I do for a living now, I run a homeless shelter and drug rehab. We have a men's home called His Place. I have 42 men there that are drug addicts right out of prison, right off of the streets. I was walking across Alaska several years ago. I brought alcoholic home with me. Most people bring home a T-shirt or a piece of salmon. I brought a drunk home. He stayed with me 8 years. We have a women's home called Hosanna Home, and we keep about 10 women there, women with babies. We took in a lady yesterday who's 31 weeks pregnant. She's been shot. So her baby, who knows, she's living homeless. She's a drug addict. So the first thing we tell them, the first thing we tell their parents when mama calls about her drunk son, the first thing we tell daddy when he calls about his drug addicted daughter is you got to have hope. The Bible says without hope, your heart will grow sick and weary. America has a heart problem, and it ain't got nothing to do with cholesterol. America has a heart problem, and it has to do with we've lost hope. And if the church has lost hope, how do we expect the world to have hope? So we need to realize there is hope.
All right, brother. Thank you for being a part of America's Hope. And thank you for being, thank you for being and showing hope in real terms, in real life. Appreciate you so much, so much, so much. Keep doing what you're doing. And thank you for being on the show tonight. Pastor Rick Hagins. Thank you so much. God bless you. And welcome back. I would like to thank our guest tonight, Carol Graham, as well as our own Chris Beers, and of course, Pastor Rick Hagins. What an incredible guy. Love his spirit. So from all three of them, we must realize that hope is not good unless you put feet to it. You've got to keep it moving. You've got to start walking it and talking it. And so with that, by our guests, let's be united and ignited to keep on spreading hope and love, freedom, and peace. Until next time, America, think about it. Good night.
United we stand, divided we fall. That's my America. United we stand, divided we fall. That's my America. From sea to shining sea, I believe in God, I believe in you. And I believe in we.
Your America and my America.